Good afternoon. I'm very glad to welcome you to all of you to the annual McGee Lecture at Vanderbilt University and our first virtual McGee Lecture in the long history of this lecture series. The McGee Lecture Fund was established in 1996 by Mr. William K. McGee, Jr. to support a lecture series intended to bring outstanding economists to the Vanderbilt campus. Our speaker today, Professor Christina Romer, continues a tradition in which the McGee Lecture series has hosted leading policymakers and many of the most distinguished economists of our time. Professor Romer is the class of 1957 Garth B. Wilson Professor of Economics at UC Berkeley. Her academic career began at the College of William and Mary, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1981. She subsequently pursued graduate studies at MIT, where she completed a PhD in economics in 1985 and held her first academic appointment at Princeton University. In 1998, Professor Romer left Princeton for UC Berkeley, where she has held a number of positions ever since. She has published widely on the nature of business cycles, the role and impact of the Federal Reserve, the causes and consequences of the Great Depression, among other topics spanning the fields of macroeconomics, monetary theory, and economic history. Professor Romer also has an extensive record of public and professional service. Most notably, she served as chair of President Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors from January 2009 to September 2010. At present, she is the president-elect of the American Economic Association, the leading association of professional economists. She has also served as vice president of the AEA, vice president and president-elect of the Western Economic Association International, and has directed, organized, and contributed to at least 4 distinct groups at the National Bureau of Economic Research. As well, over her long career, provided editorial leadership for some of the top journals in our profession, including AEJ Macro, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Journal of Economic History. Her record is filled with many of the profession's leading awards. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award at the University of California, Berkeley. She has received a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and a National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award and an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship. Last but not least, she has for a long time been one of the country's most notable public intellectuals, highlighted by her past roles as a regular contributor to the New York Times and as a contributing editor at Bloomberg Television. On behalf of the Department of Economics and Vanderbilt University, we are very glad to welcome Professor Christina Romer as this spring's speaker in the McGee Lecture Series. Professor Romer will answer questions at the end of the talk. Any participant that would like to submit a question should do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Professor Romer, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share. All right. Well, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be giving this year's McGee Lecture. I am so sorry that it has to be virtual rather than in person, but I am delighted to be with you today. Actually, the fact that we're meeting over Zoom, I think really drives home the starting point for my lecture, which is that this has been a year unlike any other year, that the United States and the world has been suffering from not one, but 2 crises. The first, obviously, is the public health crisis. So the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously just been a terrible public health event. This figure just shows you that 27 million Americans have had COVID-19. More than 500,000 of them have died. Worldwide, more than 2.5 million people have died. Millions of children have been out of school for almost an entire year. Those who can are working remotely, and those who can't worry every minute that they're on the job that they may be contracting the virus. And almost all of us, students especially, are struggling with the isolation that comes from being unable to see family and friends. But in addition to the public health crisis, it's obviously also been an economic crisis. So this picture just shows you the path of real GDP since 2000. And what you can see is that the drop in real GDP over at the beginning or the second quarter of 2020 was just enormous. That one quarter drop was 3 times as large as the biggest previous drop in our quarterly numbers. You can see that the drop was much steeper than in the Great Recession back in 2009 and 2010. You can also see that we've come back a lot, that GDP has certainly rebounded, but it's still substantially below any estimate of what our normal or potential output. And if we were to look at other indicators like employment or the unemployment rate, we know that the labor market is still in very bad shape. Unemployment remains high and jobs are still substantially below where they were before the pandemic began. Now, something that you also probably know is on the policy side, the macroeconomic policy response to the pandemic really has been extraordinary. Pandemic-related legislation has already had a budgetary cost of about $3.5 trillion. And sometime in the next few days, we will sign into law another fiscal package, adding almost another $2 trillion to that number. Just to give you a sense of how big that is, as a share of GDP, the spending to deal with the pandemic and the recession is nearly equivalent to what the United States spent on war production in the middle of World War II. Or to put it in a more modern context, it's more than 3 times as large as the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that was passed to help the US economy recover from the global financial crisis. Right? So that's the fiscal side. On the monetary side, the Federal Reserve has also somewhat quietly been taking equally extraordinary actions. They have swelled their balance sheet and reactivated a number of the emergency lending facilities that had been created back in the financial crisis. Well, it seemed to me that the McGee lecture was a good chance to step back and think about how well this macroeconomic policy response has worked. So here we are starting the second year of the pandemic. So when we think about the policy response, right, were the various actions well conceived? Did they achieve valuable results at a reasonable cost? What should have been done differently? And as the subtitle of my remarks makes clear, my evaluation is decidedly mixed. So some actions were highly desirable and successful. That's my category, the good. Some actions were frankly wrong-headed and very expensive, so the bad. And some actions perhaps had redeeming features, but were either deeply flawed or much too limited. Those are my category of the ugly. All right, so let's just jump in. And I think a good place to start our discussion of the policy response is to actually think about how a pandemic recession may differ from more ordinary recessions. And actually to preview one of my main themes, that is that to the degree that the economic policy response to the pandemic recession has been flawed, I think it's because policymakers have perhaps tried to squeeze it into a mold that it really didn't fit, that they've been thinking about the current downturn as an ordinary recession amenable to ordinary treatments, which it most definitely is not. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you think about most ordinary recessions are caused by a decline in aggregate demand. So for those of you that haven't yet studied economics, aggregate demand just refers to the total amount of spending that everyone in the economy wants to do. How much do consumers want to buy? How much do firms want to invest? How much is the government spending? And when aggregate demand declines, output and employment fall. When people stop spending, firms lay off workers, laid off workers buy less, and you get this magnified or multiplied effect. And that's absolutely what happened, say, back in 2008. That global financial crisis caused widespread uncertainty and fear, and everybody stopped spending, right? And the financial crisis also made financial institutions unwilling or unable to make loans. And so people and firms couldn't get the credit that they needed to buy cars or houses or new machines. Well, this description of what happens in a normal recession makes it clear why the ordinary response to a recession is to just try to get aggregate demand up any way that we can, right? So the government can take actions to stimulate spending. That may be by the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates and making credit more widely available. It may be by the government spending directly or by cutting people's taxes so households can spend more. And importantly, in an ordinary recession, really doesn't matter that much where the spur to demand comes from, because the help kind of flows throughout the economy. For example, if the government decides to build roads to try to deal with a recession, right? The construction workers who are hired have more income. They can buy cars, they can go to restaurants, they can take trips to Disneyland. And so that increased spending on roads, it helps to put auto workers and waiters and Disney princesses back to work. But a pandemic recession is very different, right? And now it does typically start with a decline in aggregate demand. And actually, I'm just showing you data here from last spring on what happened to restaurant reservations in New York City when the news of the virus broke. And what I want you to notice is that long before the shutdown orders had come, people had stopped going to restaurants, right? So that certainly pandemic recessions do start with a decline in spending, and then there are often some add-on effects from the shutdown orders. And this drop in spending has certainly continued through the pandemic. If you look at the numbers Americans are saving, almost twice as much as they used to. Right? And so we certainly have had a drop in aggregate demand, but this drop is kind of where the similarity with an ordinary recession stops. Right? So what's different about a pandemic recession? Well, one big difference is that the virus thrives on human interaction and hence on economic activity. And as a result, the best response can't be to just try to prevent any fall in output and employment, because such a fall in output and employment is needed, or in fact, a highly desirable outcome, right? If you want, the various lockdown and shelter-in-place orders largely codified what consumers had already intuited and what epidemiologists told us, that certain economic activities, in-person dining, air and cruise travel, concerts, lots of other productive activities just couldn't take place safely until treatments or vaccines for COVID-19 were found and were widely available. Well, an obvious effect of the difference between a pandemic recession and an ordinary recession is that the effects on people are highly unequal. So some workers who can easily switch, some workers can easily switch to working from home. they see basically no fall in their income, and they might even enjoy the freedom that comes from working in their pajamas or not having to commute. But many workers obviously can't work from home. And if their work is deemed essential, like grocery store clerks or healthcare workers, they face serious risks of illness and even death as they continue to do their jobs. And if their work is deemed non-essential, like hairdressers or food service workers, they face prolonged unemployment. A related difference is that measures to increase aggregate demand don't help everyone who's been harmed by a pandemic recession. Because some parts of the economy just can't operate without exacerbating the virus, an increase in aggregate demand won't flow to all parts of the economy. Tax cuts or infrastructure spending won't do anything to put waiters or hairdressers back to work if restaurants and beauty salons are closed for health reasons. Now, the difference between a normal recession and a pandemic recession have important implications, I think, for economic policy. One is that policy should be aimed much more at social insurance than general stimulus, right? Because, as I mentioned, stimulus won't flow through the economy as it would in an ordinary recession. Policy needs to be focused more than usual on helping the people who are directly affected. The government, for example, needs to provide support for workers who can't work because of the public health crisis. A second policy implication is that dealing with the underlying problem, the virus in this case, is much more central than usual. In an ordinary recession, it's often not necessary to solve the underlying problem. So, for example, if a recession is caused by a crash of the stock market, it's not necessary to get stock prices back up. We can get back to full employment by stimulating demand in other ways. But with a pandemic recession, how much the economy can recover is limited by the public health problem. So, trying to stimulate an economy back to full employment before you have a vaccine or effective treatments would cost many thousands of lives, and it probably wouldn't work. As increased activity made cases surge, demand would drop despite aggressive stimulus because people would just be afraid to go out. So a pandemic recession presents unique policy challenges. All right, well, with that as background, let me turn to evaluating the policy response that we've had here in the United States. And I'm actually going to start with an underappreciated policy success, and that involves monetary policy. So again, what monetary policy just refers to actions by the central bank. In the case of the US, that means actions by the Federal Reserve to help the economy. And when the virus emerged last winter and the economy started to head down, the Federal Reserve actually couldn't do very much in the realm of sort of general stimulus. So the main reason was that interest rates were already very low. So the federal funds rate, which is the rate the Fed most directly targets, you can see was just over 1.5%. Now, policymakers very quickly brought it down to zero almost immediately. But frankly, that just wasn't all that much of a drop, right? And as I mentioned, kind of in a fundamental sense, that was actually fine, right? As I mentioned, general stimulus really wasn't appropriate at a time when the economy couldn't produce at capacity and still control the coronavirus. But what was needed were measures to preserve financial stability and the flow of credit. But I think many people may not realize is things were a little bit scary last spring when the virus broke. The financial system showed some definite signs of stress. For example, this slide shows you the TED spread. And the TED spread is just a measure of the perceived riskiness of the financial system. And it's the difference between the interest rate that banks pay to borrow from one another versus the interest rate that the US government pays to borrow. And what you can see is that the TED spread definitely spiked up there last March. And in fact, the spike was in the range of what we saw, say, back in 2007, as the subprime mortgage market started to get into trouble, kind of in the run up to the financial crisis. Right? So the Fed, in fact, responded very aggressively. So one thing it did was to just flood the system with liquidity. And if this isn't a picture you've seen, I think it's really striking. So this shows the assets that are held by the Federal Reserve System. And the important thing is that when the Federal Reserve goes out into the open market and buys things like long-term government bonds or mortgage-backed securities, right? They get the assets onto their balance sheet and they're putting a bunch of cash into circulation. And what you can see is that the Federal Reserve has purchased about $3 trillion worth of Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities just over the last year. And that increase really dwarfs what was done, say, back in 2009 and 2010. And what flooding the system with liquidity does is it ensures that banks can meet all of their obligations and temporary demands for cash without doing things that will hurt their long-run health. The Fed also reactivated a number of crisis era programs that were designed to keep the financial system working well and to maintain the flow of credit. And they also created some new ones. So for example, a new program of direct lending to corporations was put into place that was designed to ensure that firms could access enough cash to cover payroll and other short-term needs during the pandemic. Now, one thing that you may have heard is that a lot of these emergency facilities have actually ended up making relatively few loans, right? But that doesn't mean that they weren't important, right? Simply by existing, such programs can help to stabilize markets and give financial institutions and investors the confidence that they need to continue lending. And if you come back to the picture of the TED spread, what you really notice is just how quickly that spread came back down, that financial markets normalized very quickly. And household and businesses were able to get loans again. Now, it's obviously impossible to know what would have happened in the absence of these extraordinary monetary actions. But I think given what we saw starting to happen back in March of 2020, it's certainly possible that financial stresses would have boiled over to a severe credit crunch, if not an outright financial crisis. And that credit markets instead stabilized quickly and functioned smoothly, I think is one of the quiet triumphs of the pandemic macroeconomic policy. I think the Fed's quick and really overwhelming response to the financial distress definitely belongs in that good category. All right, so that's monetary policy. Now, perhaps the policy that's received much more attention has certainly been the fiscal policy response. So fiscal policy just refers to deliberate actions taken by Congress and the president to affect the government budget. So any legislated changes in taxes and spending. And deliberate actions to increase the budget deficit tend to increase aggregate demand and hence increase output and employment. And the US has just done a massive amount of fiscal expansion. You know, as someone who worked to try to get us to do more on the fiscal side back in 2009, I'm frankly jealous of just how much fiscal expansion has made its way through Congress this past year. And one way to see just how aggressive the fiscal response in the United States has been is to look at what the US has done relative to other countries. And so David Romer and I have been trying to put together consistent data on the size of early pandemic fiscal packages for a sample of 30 relatively advanced economies. And we've tried very hard to make them comparable across countries. All right, so this figure just shows you the fiscal packages as a share of the country's GDP. And the US is over here in red. And what you're supposed to see is that the US, fairly early on did fiscal actions of about 11% of a year's GDP. Only New Zealand did something larger relative to the size of its economy. All right, now this picture just gives you a sense of what were the components of the US fiscal response. And clearly you see that's a real mix of spending, tax changes, aid to state and local governments, things like that. Right? So here's where I want to dive in to say, well, how much did these various measures, how well did they work? And the answer is they cover the whole spectrum. There's some good, some bad, and some I would definitely put in the ugly category. Something to say is that the numbers that I have here are just what we've spent so far. And there, as I mentioned, perhaps tomorrow we will sign into law another 1.9 trillion of fiscal stimulus. Okay, so how did the various things work? Well, let me start, firmly on the good side. I'd put the enhanced unemployment compensation. So you can see that roughly $560 billion has been spent on increased unemployment insurance payments. What's sometimes been referred to by people in Washington as UI on steroids, right? So, and what happened was that unemployment benefits were provided to workers who previously didn't qualify. So like Uber drivers and self-employed workers. Benefit payments were also increased, for example, like the early legislation increased weekly checks by $600 for everybody. And the duration of benefits has also been extended so that the unemployment insurance lasts longer than it typically would have. And I think these expanded unemployment insurance payments did just exactly what was needed. It helped those who couldn't work because their sectors were shut down to try to tame the spread of the virus, or because people were afraid to go out. And it was firmly targeted at the people who were directly hurt by the pandemic. There's also some really nice evidence showing that the unemployment insurance benefits were actually spent, really got out into circulation. So using some data from JP Morgan Chase bank records, what researchers have done is have managed to look at the spending of a sample of unemployed workers. So those are going to be the people in the picture in orange. And another sample of workers who remained employed. And everything's going to be dated relative to when the unemployed workers began receiving the larger, more generous benefits. And what you can see from this is that everybody stopped spending when the virus first hit. And before the larger unemployment payments, the unemployed cut their spending, that's the orange line, cut their spending substantially more than the workers who'd remained employed, which is, of course, exactly what you would expect. But what's really interesting is that after those expanded and increased benefits happened, the unemployed spent a lot, right? In the first few weeks after the after the spending, after the benefits increased, their spending actually outstripped that of the employed. And I think this evidence suggests that the special unemployment insurance benefits really helped unemployed workers make ends meet during the pandemic. And because the funds were spent mainly on essentials like food and rent rather than travel or entertainment, the spending was of the sort that was unlikely to further the spread of the virus. So for all those reasons, I think the UI on steroids goes firmly in the good category. All right, another piece of the fiscal response was targeted to state and local governments. So state budgets move strongly toward deficit because of the virus. So there were obviously large increases in state and local spending related to the pandemic. So states were spending more on public health, on the switch to online education, and say programs to stem the spread of the virus through the homeless population. At the same time, state tax revenues dropped as unemployment rose. And as a result, state budgets just worsened dramatically. So this graph shows you state budget shortfalls today and back in both the Great Recession and the 2001 recession. And what you can see is that the estimated budget shortfalls are in fact larger today than they were even back in 2009. And the reason this matters is because states, most of them, have balanced budget requirements. And this means that unlike the federal government, they're not allowed to run deficits over a multi-year period. Well, in this situation, transfers from the federal government, which can borrow and run deficits, can really help states to maintain services and employment. And, you know, state and local fiscal relief was an important component of the 2009 Recovery Act. And in fact, one unusual feature of the state fiscal help that was in the Recovery Act was that a large chunk of it was allocated relatively independent of how bad the recession was in the state. How much states got was determined by things like how generous was their Medicaid program before the Great Recession, or just how many miles of interstate highways are there in the state. And so it was possible to use the variation across states in how much federal help they got and how much employment fell to try to tease out the causal impact of this aid. And the answer was it mattered a lot. So this is just this picture is a scatter plot that shows the amount of aid that states got along the horizontal and the change in employment along the vertical. And what that positive relation captures is the idea that states that got more fiscal relief had smaller falls in employment. And in fact, the numbers were big, or the differences were big, and the implied cost per job saved was really low, around $27,000. Well, the CARES Act, that sort of the first really big fiscal pandemic relief measure that was passed last March, included about $150 billion of this state and local fiscal relief. And I again think that this was exactly the kind of spending that needed to be done. It was targeted largely to health spending and help for those who were affected by the pandemic. And so this type of spending, I think, goes firmly in the good category. But the truth was that a lot more was needed. So many states over the last year have already raised taxes and cut valuable spending. Just to give you an example from my own home state of California, We've been cutting money on things like foster care and child protective services, not to mention our public colleges and universities. So I think there's definitely an element of ugly here, a good fiscal package that wasn't, or a good fiscal action that wasn't nearly big enough or used nearly enough. All right, so those are, we have two things on the good or the good ugly border. I think on the less good side of the fiscal policy ledger, I'd absolutely put the one-time stimulus payments. So just to kind of help you remember, right, these payments involved a lot of money, roughly 460 billion of the budgetary impact of the COVID response came from one-time stimulus payments. So we've done one round back in the CARES Act, another round this December, and there's another round coming in the Biden stimulus, right? And the payments, right, importantly, go to everyone below a certain income threshold. So for example, those original checks were $1,200 and they went to married couples earning up to $200,000. All right, so what's not to like about the stimulus payments? Well, I think the main one is that the help is really poorly targeted. The $1,200 checks, you know, they were going to be helpful to the people who were hurting, who'd lost their jobs, who were having trouble making rent. But it was not nearly enough to truly make a difference for the most affected. And importantly, the vast majority of that $456 billion went to people who had not been economically harmed by the pandemic. That is, they hadn't lost their jobs or having trouble paying their rent. A related problem goes back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is that general stimulus doesn't flow to those in need during a pandemic recession, right? Ordinarily, anything that raises aggregate demand in a recession eventually helps unemployed workers throughout the economy. But during a pandemic, general stimulus really just can't help workers in sectors that remain closed or greatly restricted. Right now, interestingly, in the current case, the COVID relief stimulus payments also don't seem to have been particularly effective because a large fraction of the payments were saved rather than spent. And actually, one thing that I should mention is that I find very heartening about the economics profession is the degree to which economists have just thrown themselves into gathering new data and studying both the effects and the policy response to the pandemic. We just have a whole lot more information now than we did a year ago. And on the stimulus payments, economists actually conducted a survey of a large sample of recipients. And they literally asked them, what did they do with their stimulus payments? And most people said that they either saved them or used them to pay down debt. And they found that only about 15% of people surveyed report that they had mainly spent their payment. So since these stimulus payments provided little help to those who needed it and cost a lot, I would put them in the bad category, which raises the question of why did we do them and why are they a key component of the most recent Biden stimulus plan? And I suspect that it comes from thinking about the pandemic recession as just an ordinary recession, rather than as something special that requires special, more targeted policies. All right, so that's one candidate for a bad. Another candidate, at least for the less good category of fiscal policy, is the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP. Right now, the Paycheck Protection Program was a pretty pretty novel program. So it provided loans to small businesses. And if they were used to cover payroll, then, and the firm did not reduce staff, actually the loan got forgiven. That is, it morphed from a loan into an outright gift. And roughly 1/3 of the total amount of money that's been spent on pandemic relief was attributable to the Paycheck Protection Program. Right? And the idea behind the program was to give firms money if they kept paying workers rather than laying them off. So it's really not unlike unemployment insurance, but without the unemployment. And the benefit of the program is that it was supposed to help keep workers attached to firms. And if you think that matching firms and workers together is hard, it's good to preserve those relationships. Well, at least 2 studies have tried to use the fact that only firms with fewer than 300 employees were eligible for the PPP to try to measure what the program accomplished. The idea was to see if employment was higher at firms just below the size cutoff than those just above. And here are the results from one of the papers. And what you're supposed to see is that the authors find that employment was indeed higher at PPP eligible firms, suggesting that the program did help to keep workers attached to firms. But importantly, the effect was actually very small. So what lands the PPP in my bad category? Well, I think the main one is it was really expensive per job saved. Under reasonable assumptions, the implied cost per job, and hence the cost per this employee firm match that got preserved, was really high, on the order of kind of $250,000 to $350,000 per job saved. And as pointed out in a very nice paper by Glenn Hubbard and Michael Strain, it's too early to know if the matches were really truly preserved or if workers will eventually take other jobs or be laid off once the program ends. Another failing is that it was not very well targeted as social insurance. So one reason why the cost per job preserved was so high is that firms could receive grants to maintain matches that actually would have been maintained without the government support. So the money was helping people who might well have remained employed without the Paycheck Protection Program. There's also some evidence that the loans really went to the savviest borrowers rather than to the neediest. So it sure looks like an awful lot of law firms got PPP grants rather than, say, mom and pop restaurants or small businesses. All right, so that's another candidate for the bad category. I think the clearest candidate for the ugly policy category is spending on public health. So if you know the movie from which my title comes, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly character is deeply flawed, but kind of a likable person. Well, that's how I see the public health response, right? It was certainly valuable in many ways, but it had some significant flaws. So roughly $250 billion has been spent on public health, on everything from direct payment for care to vaccines to testing to contact tracing. And there have certainly been some obvious successes. And I think surely the biggest are in the area of vaccine development. Now, I like Star Trek as much as the next person, but I have to say I think the name Operation Warp Speed was somewhat unfortunate. It added an air of not very serious, of a lack of serious to something that was really important and valuable. So what the government did was to choose a number of vaccine programs and provide funding. More important, it provided guaranteed sales. But other than that, it was pretty hands-off. The program let scientists and private companies kind of do their thing within the usual regulatory framework for vaccines. And I think that the results were really nothing short of amazing. So less than a year after the program started, we have 3 highly effective vaccines authorized for emergency use. Now, as we've seen over the last 3 months, having effective vaccines is not all that matters, right? We need to get them into people's arms, and that's proven much more difficult. So there's definitely an element of ugly here. And we should have certainly, anyone who has spent hours on one of the websites trying to get an appointment will tell you that we should have spent more on website development and on production and distribution. But I suspect that the rapid vaccine development is a triumph that we will someday tell our children about. And it's the one thing that's the most likely to enable the economy to truly recover in the not too distant future. Now, some of the other spending on public health, I think, has been much less successful, either because of inadequate investment or poor administration. The US lags on some other important dimensions. So for example, we conduct fewer tests per 1,000 people than a lot of other rich countries. Or another number that I think is very telling, we're much worse at genetic sequencing of cases to identify variants and patterns of transmission. So just to give you a sense, Iceland, which is up here at the top, sequences about 60% of all its cases. The US, which is down here at number 29, sequences just less than 1%. And so as a result, we just know much less about emerging variants and where and how transmission is occurring. So based on the experience of other countries, I think we could have done much better at getting the virus under control if we'd had a more effective and wider reaching public health response. And that, I have to say, is not just ugly, it truly is a tragedy. But overall, I think the fiscal response has really basically run the gamut from good to bad to certainly some very ugly pieces. All right, well, that's what we've done so far. I think the obvious question is, where do we go from here? So I've been discussing and evaluating the macro policy response so far. But clearly the story isn't over, right? We're on the verge of, as I mentioned, yet another fiscal program to deal with the pandemic and the recession. And there's much debate about where the virus and the economy are headed over the next several months. So as I've alluded to, the Biden stimulus plan is winding its way through Congress, and it definitely has some very valuable pieces. So you certainly see the continuation of expanded unemployment insurance, which I think is something that's absolutely called for. It's social insurance for those directly harmed by the pandemic. One of the things I'm very excited about is it has $350 billion of that aid for state and local governments, which was another kind of targeted relief and something that's been just desperately needed. It also has about another $100 billion of public health measures, including vaccine production and distribution. And since dealing with the virus is the most important step in healing the economy, I think this is a great use of funds. I think the one sort of black eye, or at least the piece I'm least excited about, is that those stimulus checks are a sort of a centerpiece of the new program. We're going to be spending roughly another $400 billion. And as I've described, I think that's really not what's needed at this point. It's expensive, and more importantly, it doesn't get money where it's most needed. All right, so what's likely to happen to the economy over the next several months? Well, first, as I've mentioned throughout my talk, it all depends on the virus. I think economic recovery depends fundamentally on the state of public health. If vaccines get widely distributed and they remain effective, scientists tell us that the virus should wane dramatically. And in this case, I think the economy is likely to do well. On the other hand, if the vaccine rollout falters and premature relaxation of mask and shutdown rules allows new variants to emerge, the virus could surge again and the economy would clearly suffer. Now, if the virus does get under control, I actually am optimistic that we could see a pretty quick recovery. So why do I say that? Well, first, the Biden stimulus is really big. We've got another $2 trillion of aggregate demand that's about to hit the economy. I think even more important, private demand could come back strongly. Consumers may be in a very good position to start spending. The personal saving rate today is about twice what it was back in 2010, mainly because consumers haven't been able to spend on many of the items that they want. Or if you look at, say, the ratio of household debt service to disposable income, it's about 25% lower than it was back in 2010, in large part because people have been buying a lot less on credit. And I think that the really apt comparison for the situation today is what happened after World War II. So this slide comes from some really interesting work that Gillian Brunette has been doing. And this picture shows you private saving of both households and institutions going all the way back to 1930. And what you notice is that the sort of the closest parallel to the surge in saving that we've been seeing during the pandemic is what happened back during World War II. And what Brunette points out is that consumption restrictions during the war just led to a vast accumulation of savings. And we know what happened following the war, right? Consumer expenditures, particularly on things like housing and consumer durables, just increased rapidly. And actually, if you look on a state-by-state basis, in proportion to how much saving had been accumulated in the state. And I think it's very likely that the same is likely to happen today, provided it's safe to produce and consume the goods and services that households want. All right, well, how about this? That raises another question, and one you might have been hearing economists talk about, and that is, do we in fact need to worry not about the recession continuing, but about the economy overheating and inflation picking up? And there's been a lot of chatter among economists, including Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, that maybe we're doing too much to help the economy and that the economy is in fact going to boom and that that's going to lead to inflation. So I'll say I'm actually not that worried about it. I think the first thing is just a quick reality check. I think we're a long way from being fully recovered. So this picture, I showed you GDP before, and certainly GDP has bounced back a lot. But if you look at total employment, what you really notice is, well, employment obviously just plummeted last spring, and it has come back strongly, but total jobs are still down about 10 million relative to where they were before the pandemic started. So that means that we have a long way to go before we have a shortage of labor that starts to drive up wages and prices. The other reason that I'm not that worried about inflation is that over the last couple of decades, inflation has shown itself to be remarkably well contained. It doesn't seem to respond very much to the state of the economy, either on the downside or on the upside, or at least it takes a while. Our expectations seem to be very well anchored when it comes to inflation. And so I think it's very likely that we have a fair amount of room for the economy to grow without people starting to expect more inflation and inflation actually starting to go up. All right, so I'm not that worried about the economy overheated and inflation. What does worry me somewhat coming out of the pandemic is rising government debt. Because of the pandemic and the extreme actions that have been taken to deal with it, the US debt to GDP ratio, our government debt to GDP ratio, has absolutely surged. And you can see this. These are data coming from the Congressional Budget Office. And you can see that our debt to GDP ratio has definitely jumped in the last year. And in fact, when people add in the impact of the Biden stimulus, our debt levels are going to be higher than the highest they'd ever been before, which is back during World War II. All right, now, importantly, all that debt, it's not an immediate worry. We're not likely to face a debt crisis where other countries refuse to lend to us. The US government is still viewed as just about the safest place or the very safest borrower in the world. And interest rates, as we've discussed, are already very low. So servicing the debt is not going to be a large burden. What I mainly worry about is that these high debt loads may limit what policymakers feel comfortable doing in coming years. Right? The US, if you think about it, has so many things we could usefully spend money on. We need to repair our infrastructure. We need to deal with the effects of climate change and prevent further global warming. We need to invest in people so that everyone has an equal shot at doing well and living a decent life. And I worry that the high debt loads are going to make policymakers hesitant to take those necessary actions. So if I had a piece of advice for policymakers today, it's that we need a plan right now for how we're going to navigate this. And it's going to involve spending money wisely. We should never do wasteful spending, even in the middle of a pandemic. And we should be setting out plans for how to deal with the debt and the deficit over time. We need to be honest that we'll eventually need to raise taxes on those who can bear it. And we're going to need to cut spending that doesn't help people or that doesn't make the economy more productive in the long run. And I think making a plan to deal with the fiscal situation now would give us the space to do what we need to do to continue to heal the economy and improve the condition of all Americans right now. All right, so where does all this leave us? Well, as we all know, we have been through a year like no other. It's certainly like no other in my lifetime. I think the combined pain of both a terrible public health crisis and an economic crisis has been devastating. Now, as I've described, I think the overall success of the macroeconomic policy response to the pandemic has been decidedly mixed. There's certainly been much that's good. The monetary policy helped to stabilize the financial system and keep credit flowing. A sequence of fiscal packages has provided funds for helping millions of Americans deal with unemployment and other economic distress. And the spending on vaccine development may help to create a true miracle and recovery from this pandemic. There was also a fair amount that was not so good. We've spent a lot of money on things with relatively little benefit, like the stimulus payments and the Paycheck Protection Program. And there are some actions that had promise, like money for aggressive testing and surveillance or state and local fiscal relief, that didn't go nearly far enough. My hope is that this nightmare will be over before too long, but I do think we need to keep learning from this experience about which macroeconomic policies worked and which didn't, because that's going to be the best way to figure out the policies that will help us to weather the next storm, whatever form that might take. All right, well, thank you. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Romer, for a very enlightening talk. We'll now move to the Q&A portion of the seminar, and I'd remind everyone that they should feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. The Q&A segment will be moderated by myself and Professor Peter Rousseau, Chair of the Department of Economics at Vanderbilt University.
And it's gotten dark as I've been talking, and let me go click on a few lights so that I don't look quite so surreal here.
That sounds fair enough.
It doesn't normally happen in most seminar rooms, but now that we're all at, oh, that's just even worse. So, all right, well, we'll just do with what we have.
Very well. Our first question comes from my colleague, Mario Crucini, who asks, shouldn't we give wage supplements to workers in essential businesses relative to those who work 0 hours at the low end of the income distribution? Public hazard pay, so to speak? This seems preferred to one-time non-contingent payments of fixed amounts that are not conditional on work.
I could not agree more. So Mario and I clearly have a mind meld. And in fact, David Romer and I are working on a paper for one of the AEA journals, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, exactly on this idea that what's unique about a pandemic recession is that sort of general stimulus is not a good way to help the people that have been particularly affected. And so we need to be doing things like unemployment insurance and these targeted payments. But I agree completely that you've got a lot of workers who are on the front lines. They're healthcare workers, they're grocery store clerks, they're the people delivering all of our packages. And I think they absolutely deserve hazard pay. And I think that would have been an excellent use of funds. I think it would both have been you can make it on an argument of fairness. You can make it on an argument of how do you make sure that you have enough workers who are willing to do those jobs. You do want to make those jobs, because they are so valuable, particularly during a pandemic. You want people to stay in them and feel well treated in them. So I think that's a great point. And it's actually one of the things we've been trying to work on is, to go beyond this would be a good idea to say who should get it, how much should they get, that all the sort of the specifics get much harder. But I think it is something that we can work out, and I think there are some good ideas about what could be done.
Thank you, Professor Romer. Let me thank you again on behalf of the Department of Economics at Vanderbilt for your participating and providing such a insightful lecture today for the McGee event. My question is submitted by Albert Schub, and he asks, in your opinion, are the one-time stimulus checks politically motivated to woo voters in past and future elections?
What's the right thing to say is that's outside my knowledge space. It is clear that they're very popular. I think that is something that I think they're very popular with everyone except economists, right? So that we have been talking about the value of targeted payments, the value of payments to state and local governments, the value of public health spending, but certainly the stimulus payments do make a lot of people happy, in part because they are so widely distributed. Whether it's political motivation or just a desire to help in any way possible. I'm not going to speculate, but I do think it is, we've now spent more than $800 billion on this. And I think that's money that, as Mario put it, should have been spent on hazard pay, or should have been spent on public health, or should have been spent on the long list of other things that the country needs, and that we're going to be needing to spend money on in coming years.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Edward Ding, who asks, how has the US economic recovery compared to that of other peer countries?
So I think if you look at, the IMF recently put out sort of some of their kind of world growth numbers. And what you do see is that the US has bounced back somewhat, faster than certainly Europe. So some other areas. We haven't done as well as China or the countries of Asia. So, I think it's amazing what you can do when you spend $3.5 trillion. So it has certainly helped us to bounce back. I do think it's really important, though. I mean, one of the things that this drives home is that what's so unique about this experience and this recession is that getting the virus under control is the sort of the fundamental thing that has to happen to make the economy recover. You could spend, many more trillions of dollars, and if people don't feel safe going out and spending, you're not going to, or if there are people that just can't do their occupations, you're not going to get economic growth. And so, I think we've done okay on the economic side. We've bounced back in many ways, but we do still have a long way to go. And the key thing for why is a country like China or Australia or Korea growing more rapidly? It's because they've gotten the virus more firmly under control. And my hope is that as the vaccine rolls out more, that will be our experience. But that really is, I think, the unknown and the thing that has to happen. And I think one of the things that I think has certainly frustrated every scientist I know, and I think economists would agree that to the degree that we have squandered some of what we could have been doing on the public health side has had very large economic consequences. So it's precisely because there's no healing this economy until we deal with the public health problem.
Thank you, Professor Romer. The next question is from Ella Choi, who asks, is there a fiscal policy you would implement that hasn't been implemented during the pandemic?
That's a great one. So until the Biden stimulus, I was firmly on we need more state and local fiscal relief. So I think that has been, we did a small amount in the CARES Act a year ago, but that has been I think the thing that has really been missing. And for some reason, again, I showed you some of the evidence on the state fiscal relief from the Recovery Act, because, that was kind of the first time we'd used aid to state and local governments as a sort of a counter-cyclical or anti-recession policy. And the research is really strong that it works really well. It maintains government services, it maintains state employment, but it also maintains employment more generally in the state because people are still, government workers are still employed, they're still building roads in a state. And so that sort of spreads through the whole state economy. And we were just really, and especially the pandemic has just been a big burden on states in terms of the spending on schools and on health. And so that was just something I think that was missing tremendously. So I'm delighted that that's finally into the rotation again. It is something that is uniquely unpopular with members of Congress to just say, let's give money to governors so that they can spend it as they think it needs to be spent. But it's good policy. I think my second one would be Mario's idea of hazard pay, so that is a targeted payment to people that are putting their lives on the line. And I think that, perhaps, in terms of, is it going to have, I think it's really important from a fairness and a keeping the economy functioning well. But I think it can also have impacts in an aggregate demand sense, because a lot of those frontline workers are quite low wage. So if you think about home healthcare aides or a lot of the non-doctor and nurses who play such an important role in our healthcare system, or retail clerks and logistics people, those are typically fairly low wage workers. So if you give them a boost through something like hazard pay, they are likely to spend it on essentials that the economy is still producing, even in a pandemic. And so you do get, to the degree you want a boost to aggregate demand, I think that's a reasonably good way to do it. So that would be very high on my list of additional fiscal actions that I'd take.
Thank you again. Our next question comes from Zev Cernik, who writes, you spoke about how the primary issue associated with rising federal debt is the potential unwillingness of policymakers to spend money on necessary programs in the future. Considering the continued consumer confidence in US bonds and our ability to pay the interest on the debt, is there any real problem with a rising debt besides the poor optics of such a large number?
That's a deep question, and there have certainly, there's been quite a revolution in economic thinking. Certainly, I remember back to 2010 when the whole world suddenly became very frightened of large debts, and there was a move kind of worldwide to go to fiscal austerity. And a lot of that has changed. One of the things, I mentioned being jealous of how much fiscal expansion. I think the right thing to say is I've been amazed and pleased at the degree to which we have been willing to spend money to deal with what was a once in a century or longer kind of twin crisis. So anyway, so we have certainly seen a change. It is certainly true that I don't think anything terrible is going to happen in the near to medium future about if we have a bigger debt to GDP ratio. It is certainly true that interest rates are really low, and if the government can borrow at a low interest rate and there's productive things for them to spend the money on, it's a sensible thing to do. I think we don't want to get too complacent, because interest payments are really low now because interest rates are really low. But you have to ask what's going to happen as we go forward. And one of the things that happens as your debt gets higher is interest rates tend to go up. So I was just looking at some data, the recent projections that the Congressional Budget Office put out, and they certainly see over the next 20 years, the equilibrium real interest rate going up in large part because the government's borrowing a lot, but also, to the degree we think that private households and businesses are going to be spending a lot, that's also going to be something that would tend to push up interest rates. So government debt payments right now are delightfully low, but nothing says that interest rates will stay low forever. So I think that is certainly a risk. And then, I think the evidence is that high debt loads are something that does tend to constrain policymakers. Now, maybe we should just try to say, listen, if you've got good things to spend it on, don't freak out over high debt levels. That might work, but I'm actually, again, perhaps I'm scarred from the experience back in 2010 that doesn't seem to be how policymakers think. And so I am very worried that we get through the pandemic, debt loads are at historic highs, and suddenly Congress says, no, we can't deal with climate change, and no, we're not going to rebuild our roads and highways. And I think that would be a really bad situation for the country. So I think the way to navigate this is not to, as I mentioned, not to let's just not spend now, but actually let's talk about how are we going to have do the things that we can and should do now, and still not get ourselves on a trajectory for the government budget that really someday will have to be not sustainable. And so I think it's just smart to be planning ahead, if for no other reason that it allows you to do what you need to do right now in a responsible way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and this is a related one from Matthew Binkley, who asks, a substantial fiscal stimulus is absolutely necessary, and an infrastructure bill is long overdue. But it also leads to the question, is the US economy in danger of becoming more Japan-like? It seems like we need more and more debt in order to keep the economy growing. First, a $1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus, and now a rumored $2 trillion infrastructure bill that is de facto stimulus. How does the US economy get back to a stable equilibrium?
I mean, this goes back to a debate that we were having actually long before the pandemic about, we were certainly having discussions of secular stagnation, and were we not going to have enough demand at, positive real interest rates without the government doing a whole lot of spending. I have tended to be on the more optimistic side, that I think the fundamentals of the US economy are, quite good. I think maybe it comes from spending my life around brilliant young people, that you do have this sense that people are going to come up with solutions to technological problems and with great new ideas. So I think people are selling the US economy too short, that we will continue to have productivity growth, we'll continue to have highly educated workers, and we will remain a strong and vital economy. It's hard to know what life is going to be like when we get through this thing. As I mentioned, I suspect that we're going to see a lot of private demand. And so, if we do we are going to do the 1.9 trillion stimulus. I think, there's no one that loves infrastructure as much as Joe Biden. So I would expect to do a big infrastructure bill. But we're going to need to, we're going to have to see where the economy goes. And, the Federal Reserve has certainly said it wants to help the recovery, and that it is happy to have inflation go somewhat above 2%, but they're not going to be passive forever. So if we grow as quickly as I think, at some point the Fed would certainly step in to try to slow that down. But my guess is that we will recover, we'll grow fairly strongly, and that we're not on the verge of becoming Japan, with just takes continued fiscal stimulus to keep the economy going. I think that we'll find that private consumption and private investment will step in and fill the hole that there might be.
Thank you again, Professor Romer, on behalf of the Department of Economics and Vanderbilt University. We are very grateful for an engaging and enlightening seminar. To all of the viewers today, thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you at a future McGee lecture. Thank you again.
All right, well, thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you.